Good morning. Welcome to today's Learn at Lunchtime program from the State Museum of Pennsylvania. I am Beth Erickson. Our topic today is climate change in Pennsylvania from impacts to action. And with us is Lindsay Byron, Environmental Group Manager for the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. Lindsay is a professional geologist and certified climate change professional, currently serving as Environmental Group Manager in DEP's Energy Programs Office. She is responsible for managing the Commonwealth's climate change program, including the development of Pennsylvania's triennial climate impacts assessment and climate action plan. Hello, Lindsay, and thank you for joining us today.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure.
So tell us more about yourself and what you do at DEP.
Yeah, so as you said, I am a professional geologist by licensure, and I've been with the department since 2015. I've been in my current role in DEP's Energy Programs Office since 2018, and our office is responsible for a lot of programs related to clean energy, energy efficiency, alternative fuels, climate change, of course, which is what I specialize in, and energy security as well.
So today's topic is climate change in Pennsylvania. What will you be sharing with us today?
Well, I'm going to talk about some of the impacts that Pennsylvania is experiencing related to climate change, and our efforts here at DEP and at the state to address those impacts and to mitigate climate change.
So Lindsay, when you are ready, you can begin.
Great, thank you, Beth. So as I said, I'm Lindsay Byron. And a primary role of mine here at DEP is to manage the state's climate change program. Listed here are Pennsylvania's top climate-related priorities. These priorities include state and local climate action planning, grid decarbonization, that's our electricity grid, industrial sector decarbonization, building energy efficiency, zero emission vehicle transportation, adaptation and resiliency, and importantly, environmental justice and equity. So the climate program that I manage was created by the Pennsylvania Climate Change Act, which is Act 70 of 2008. This act requires DEP to do several things. One is to develop a climate impacts assessment and a climate action plan, and we update those documents every 3 years. We also develop and update annually an inventory of Pennsylvania's greenhouse gas emissions. And we administer a climate change advisory committee, which meets bi-monthly. And those meetings are open to the public. So I do love to encourage public attendance and participation whenever I give these talks. The Act also required DEP to set up a voluntary registry of greenhouse gas emissions. And this was accomplished by a nationwide effort called the Climate Registry. And I provided links to all of these documents and resources in this presentation. So if those slides are made available to you, those are also available to you. So I'll talk a little bit about climate impacts. Our most recent climate impacts assessment was published in 2021. And this report, as I said, is updated every 3 years. The first iteration was completed in 2009. So every 3 years, we update the report to reflect the latest available climate science and impacts. And in this iteration, we took a risk-based approach so that we could better understand relative timing and severity of impacts and where those impacts are going to be felt more severely. We also wanted to make it more actionable so that the information in this report could better inform the climate action plan. So briefly, climate projections in Pennsylvania show that Pennsylvania like the rest of the Northeast, is becoming warmer and wetter and will continue to become warmer and wetter. Over the past 110 years or so, temperatures in Pennsylvania have increased on average by nearly 2 degrees Fahrenheit, and we expect an additional 6 degrees Fahrenheit by 2050. We will feel the bulk of these heat impacts in our cities where high temperatures are exacerbated by heat island effects, and we'll see an increased frequency of 100+ degree days. Precipitation is also projected to increase. We've already seen a 10% increase in average precipitation since the early 20th century, and we expect an additional 8 to 14% increase in that precipitation. And here I'm showing that graphically. The top row of maps is average annual number of days with temperatures above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And the bottom row of maps is the number of days with very heavy precipitation. And in the report, we do define what very heavy means. But what we're showing here is from our baseline, which is the years 1971 through 2000, to mid-century and to the end of century, what those changes are going to look like across Pennsylvania. And you can see a lot of these impacts are going to be more seriously felt in the southeast and southwest Pennsylvania, which is also where we happen to see a high density of our environmental justice communities, or communities facing environmental justice concerns. So in this table, we illustrate the overall risk for each hazard and consequence category. So the hazards that we evaluated are listed down at the rows, and the consequence categories against which we rated those hazards are across the top in the columns. So these values in this table represent the product of how likely each hazard is and the individual consequence of those hazards on each of these categories. So, for example, the red values are the more severe risks, where we find the more severe risks, and the yellow are a bit less severe. Our highest possible risk score here is 16, which you can see is felt by human health impacts of heat waves and forest ecosystems and wildlife impacts of increasing average temperatures. And I'll get into a little bit of what that actually looks like in terms of impacts. So currently, flooding is the highest risk hazard in Pennsylvania. And I think we've all probably experienced this risk or this hazard to some degree, particularly in recent years. And this risk is increasing through time and will continue to increase. And at the same time, the risks from increasing average temperatures and heat waves are increasing. We can expect flooding from heavy rain events to affect our built infrastructure, so our homes, our roads, our bridges, human health, agriculture, and have ripple effects throughout the economy. Increasing average temperatures, of course, affects nearly every aspect of life. We will see more frequent and common heat waves, and more severe heat waves, which are, of course, a health risk, particularly those for our vulnerable populations. And something we wanted to really incorporate thoroughly throughout our work here in the climate program is this acknowledgement that climate change is not going to be felt by all Pennsylvanians equally. And some people are going to be at greater risk because of where they live, their inability to locate, their income, their housing conditions, their health, and other factors. I want to take a particular focus at the impacts to human health of climate change. Of course, with greater heat waves, we can expect more heat-related illnesses or deaths. Allergies are also getting worse. We are seeing extended allergy seasons. I myself have been feeling that this year with more earlier onset of spring allergies. There's also a correlation of violence and crimes related to increased heat and climate change. And mental health disorders. There's a correlation between mental health and climate change, as well as our community health. So I'll move on to our climate action plan and talk about what we can do to combat these changes and to adapt to these changes. So our climate action plan, we also updated in 2021, and we're currently working on the 2024 iteration of both of these plans. The 2021 plan updated the business as usual emissions scenario projections, which are the greenhouse gas emissions we can expect to see with no change in policy. It outlines a pathway to reach greenhouse gas reductions of 26% from 2005 levels by the year 2025 and an 80% reduction by 2050. It also provides quantified greenhouse gas reductions and economic costs and benefits, and includes co-benefits such as health benefits of greenhouse gas reduction strategies. Our priority adaptation actions were directly informed by the risk assessment that we did in the 2021 climate impacts assessment. So in that matrix that I showed earlier, those areas with the deep red scores were focused on for priority adaptation actions in our climate action plan. And we focused on equity throughout this plan and discussed equity concerns with each strategy we set forth in the plan. So this chart shows our business as usual emissions projected through mid-century. The different colors are broken out, our emissions broken out by sector. As you can see here, Pennsylvania's electricity generation, industrial, and transportation sectors, that is orange, blue, and green, this middle blue here, respectively, are the three largest sectors contributing to greenhouse gas emissions in Pennsylvania, making them important sectors to prioritize for greenhouse gas reduction strategies. While we have made progress, the modeling that we've done for this plan indicates that we will not continue to reduce our emissions unless we implement new strategies and new policies. The good news is that it is possible to meet our goals by implementing the strategies laid out in the 2021 plan. This wedge chart shows the modeled greenhouse gas reductions possible for each sector included in the plan against the business as usual, which is the top line we see on this chart. And these wedges are color-coded the same as our, they should be color-coded the same as the wedges on the previous chart. This orange wedge here is where we anticipate being able to make the greatest amount of greenhouse gas reductions, and that's in our electricity generation sector, as well as in our transportation sector, the green wedge, and industrial sector, the yellow wedge here on this chart. So we identified strategies that can be implemented in the near, mid, and longer terms. And while I've not listed them out individually here, I've lumped them together in generalized topics. So the low-hanging fruit, those strategies that can be implemented in the near term, really focus on energy efficiency and distributed generation, such as rooftop and community solar. Midterm strategies include deploying more electric vehicles, reducing vehicle miles traveled, and carbon sequestration in our agricultural and forestry sectors. Oops, pardon me. The more challenging longer-term strategies are deploying medium and heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles, and the big heavy hitter is creating a zero-carbon electricity grid. Finally, as mentioned earlier, this climate action plan includes adaptation strategies informed by our climate impacts risk assessment. For each adaptation priority, as identified in the risk assessment and shown on this slide, we have developed an adaptation plan, an adaptation pathway, which is a recommended sequence of strategies to adapt to and prepare for climate change impacts. These pathways specifically focus on human health, environmental justice and equity, and built infrastructure. And the primary hazards we aim to address are increasing average temperatures, heat waves, and flooding. And what this sort of adaptation planning might look like in action is Philadelphia's Beat the Heat initiative, which is not an initiative of DEP, but it's an excellent example of how data collection, data analysis, planning, and community outreach can result in adaptation strategies towards remediating some of these impacts we're experiencing with climate change. So I've included links to the vulnerability index map and the Beat the Heat plan here for your reference. So I'm going to briefly go over some of our laws, regulations, policies, and programs in Pennsylvania related to energy and climate. Some of these I'm more familiar with than others. So if you have specific questions and I'm not able to answer them, my email address is at the end of the slideshow. I welcome questions to my email address, and I will find the answer for you. So Executive Order 2019-1 directed Commonwealth agencies to reduce energy, procure renewable energy to offset our electricity use. It set design standards for new buildings and renovations in Commonwealth-owned buildings, and goals for electrifying state fleet vehicles. It also established the Green Gov Council, which acts sort of as a sustainability office for the state. And what I don't have on this slide, but is equally important, this executive order set greenhouse gas reduction goals for the state, which I noted earlier, 25% by 2025 and 80% by 2050 from our 2005 levels. Some laws and regulation related to reducing greenhouse gases include oil and gas sources emissions control regulations. These regulations reduce emissions, specifically VOCs, from natural gas well sites, compressor stations, and pipelines. But the reduction of methane and greenhouse gases is a co-benefit of that regulation. Laws like Act 213 and Act 129 were not specifically passed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They were passed as energy security and energy efficiency measures, but those have resulted and do result in greenhouse gas reductions. Some other planning efforts happening in the state. DCNR has put out a climate change adaptation and mitigation plan for Pennsylvania's state parks and forests. They are currently working on updating this plan. I believe it's on a 5-year update schedule. And Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission has a climate action plan that outlines strategies for increasing adaptation of Pennsylvania's fisheries and aquatic wildlife. PennDOT also has conducted a vulnerability study to assess the vulnerability of our state transportation infrastructure to extreme weather. Related to that, other transportation initiatives include a memorandum of understanding that Pennsylvania is a signatory to accelerate the market for electric, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles. And if you'll remember, that's one of our long-term strategy for Pennsylvania. We've also done EV roadmap planning. There's links to that here for your reference as well. Driving PA Forward is another planning initiative. It provides funds for transitioning to cleaner fuels for diesel engines, including electricity, compressed natural gas, and propane, and newer diesel vehicles. We have funding available through Alternative Fuel Incentive Grant, or as we call it, AFIG, that provides rebates for individual consumers of electric vehicles and grant funding for businesses and communities for vehicles and vehicle infrastructure. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, one of our priorities in the state is supporting local government climate action planning. So we do have a local climate action program where we've paired with Penn State to provide assistance to local governments in developing their own greenhouse gas inventories and climate action plans. And to date, we've supported organizations representing over 400 local governments, I believe, in developing their own greenhouse gas inventories and climate action plans. And we support those communities through a shared energy manager program where we provide funding for a shared energy manager to help these local governments implement their strategies in their local climate action plans. And of course, the big news right now is federal investment through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. And these are really once in a generation investments in our infrastructure, in our energy infrastructure, and in our climate change action across the nation. So these programs invest in American manufacturing and workers, expand access to energy efficiency and clean energy for families, communities, and businesses, reduce greenhouse gases. With a focus on providing those benefits to environmental justice communities. That's what this Justice 40 initiative is, whereas 40% of the funding provided by these two acts for many of the programs is dedicated to environmental justice communities. So the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law nationwide provides 1.2 trillion in funding for transportation, electric vehicles, abandoned mines, abandoned oil and gas wells and brownfields, clean water, broadband access, and clean energy. DEP's Energy Programs Office expects to receive approximately $67 million in formula funding to invest in Pennsylvania. And some of those details are outlined here. And you can also contact me if you have questions about these programs. The Inflation Reduction Act provides $369 billion in spending on energy and climate change. This bill alone nationwide is expected to reduce America's, United States, greenhouse gas emissions to 40% below 2005 levels by 2030, which is huge. And Energy Programs Office in DEP is expecting to receive $261 million of these funds that we are investing in environmental justice communities to reduce energy burdens. We're expanding access to energy efficiency solutions for individuals, families, and communities and businesses. Increasing the generation of clean power, increasing our energy resilience, and deploying for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. One of the big initiatives that we're undertaking right now with these funds is through the US EPA's climate pollution reduction grants, where the state is set to receive $3 million to do climate action planning, which will make Pennsylvania and its local governments eligible for implementation grants. So there will be more information about that coming out soon. But a question I get a lot is not only what is the state doing, what is Pennsylvania doing, what is DEP doing about climate change, but also what can we do as individuals do about climate change. And we have generated in our 2018 Climate Action Plan a list of specific actions that individuals can do, that businesses can do to reduce their carbon footprint. And I listed some of those here with links to PA Power Switch, or, not every home is a good candidate for for solar panels, but every home can switch their power generator to clean energy producers. So that's one item folks can do. But, and I like to end my talks with this slide, and I'm not going to play the video, but the most important thing we can do, according to Katharine Hayhoe, is talk about climate change. And this is a great TED Talk that she gives, so I encourage you to check it out if you have interest. But people talking about climate change, supporting climate change action and initiatives and policies is the most important thing we can do to combat climate change. So I'll close by stressing the importance of urgent action to not only mitigate the cause of climate change by reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, but also to adapt to the impacts that we are already experiencing and will continue to experience. This action must be taken at all levels of government and in partnership with Pennsylvania citizens, non-governmental organizations, academia, and businesses to meaningfully address the climate change related challenges we face. Thank you.
It was fantastic. Thank you so much. I was coming up with questions and then realizing, oh, wait, she just said that. Oh, she just said that. So you covered a lot of information, but given that, there's still more questions. I have one to start with on a professional level. How does a geologist end up working on climate change?
Well, if I'm honest, it's a little bit of luck. I came to the department as a geologist. I worked in our Bureau of Oil and Gas Planning and Program Management, working on plugging abandoned and orphan wells. I was the plugging geologist for the department. And I've always had an interest in climate change and climate change impacts. And by luck, I saw an opportunity posted to do exactly this work with the department. And so I went for it.
That's great. That's great. It is interesting when you start your plan of what you think you're going to do with your life. You're not quite ever sure where you're going to end up. So that's fantastic.
I almost couldn't believe it that somebody gets to do this work.
And it is important work. There were a lot of points that you mentioned that hit for me personally. One was allergies. They are definitely increasing. You hear more people complaining about suffering from congestion and itchy eyes. With climate change, is this a result of more plants growing, or is it longer growing periods for plants or different types of plants? How is that impact happening?
So I think it's primarily the longer growing season. Our springs are beginning earlier and our falls are lasting longer, but it's also not just spring allergies and pollen related allergies, but mold allergies are increasing as well as we experience greater precipitation. We're experiencing more flooding. With that flooding comes the potential for mold. So people who are sensitive to mold allergies as well are feeling those impacts.
That's a very good point. During your presentation, you mentioned several times vulnerable populations. Who would that include?
Yeah, so attributes of a population that might make them more vulnerable to climate change or to other environmental issues includes ethnicity. Black populations are historically disinvested in those communities. Poor communities, lower income communities are vulnerable. Our older populations, our elderly populations are more vulnerable to these impacts. Our very young populations, babies and children, are also more vulnerable to these impacts. But even groups of people that you wouldn't necessarily consider as vulnerable populations can feel the effects of these impacts more severely. For example, people who work outside, people in construction, roofers, are going to be more impacted by these increased instances of heat waves and higher average temperatures.
Oh, that makes sense. Thank you for clarifying that. I have a couple of specific questions. How do Pennsylvania agencies compare to other state agencies in their preparedness for climate change? That is, are we on par, behind, or ahead of most other states?
That is a really good question. I would say it really depends what state we're being compared to. As you can imagine, states like California have very progressive laws and policies. They're implementing laws to eliminate the sales of internal combustion engine vehicles. And then there are other states who maybe don't have laws and policies that are as protective of our environment as Pennsylvania.
I would assume similarly, there are slightly different problems in different states as well related to climate change. You mentioned California, where water would be a different issue in California than it would be here in Pennsylvania. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay.
And Gulf states, of course, are very vulnerable to flooding.
Excellent. I have a couple more. One is, I realize you are with DEP, but where are the other Pennsylvania environmental environmental agencies and their progress toward planning. You did mention a couple. I believe you mentioned DCNR and possibly Fish and Boat, but how does everybody coordinate those?
Yeah, so I did show a couple slides with PennDOT has done a vulnerability assessment that was done in 2017. DCNR is doing climate action planning. They're currently updating that, and they're going to have a new plan out, I think, in 2024 or 2020, either this year or next year. Their new adaptation plans coming out. Fish and Boat Commission just recently put out their climate action plan. But the Department of Health as well, they've stood up a sort of work group specifically for the impacts of climate change on health and how those interact. So you might expect that DEP, as the environmental agency in Pennsylvania, of course, is going to be tuned into doing work on climate change, but it is a problem that affects every sector of our lives, every aspect of our lives. So these DEP or Pennsylvania's other agencies are also beginning to do those sort of planning efforts.
This question may be a little bit outside. I'm assuming this would be more of a game commission or DCNR, but how are climate change threats to wildlife determined or quantified? Is that more a game commission, DCNR?
Yeah, so we do talk a little bit about ecological impacts of climate change in DEP's climate action planning. I can't really speak to the methodology for quantifying those impacts, but Game Commission's Climate Action Plan and DCNR's Climate Action Plan are both really great resources for those methodologies.
Okay. And actually, we just had somebody drop into the Q&A, and I'll put it in chat. Somebody from Fish and Boat dropped in their conservation plans. So thank you. Question regarding, this is a very specific question regarding your presentation. Can you explain the scale used to measure the effects caused by climate change in your table? When you say that EJ will be affected by 12, what does 12 mean in severity and or specific results or consequences that the EJ zones will suffer? This is very specific.
This is very specific. And
would this be one where somebody should email you and ask you?
Yes, that would be excellent. And I can respond to that and show that methodology exactly where that is in the report.
Okay, we'll have the person I'll make sure that you two connect. Another question, how much can be attributed for climate change through natural causes and how much is human intervention or human caused?
That's a great question. And I did not share a slide on, there are charts showing kind of breaking out how much of our greenhouse gas emissions are natural and how much are human made. But the overwhelming majority of our greenhouse gas emissions are the product of the combustion of fossil fuels, which is human caused.
Understood. Well, that leads me to a question. You mentioned electricity choice and electricity generation. I personally recently just went through and looking at that. Some of the choices can be expensive if you're choosing wind or solar. Why is it worth it?
Well, if you are solely looking at the cost, that can sometimes be the answer. Right now, I am purchasing 100% renewable energy for my home, and my rate is 2 cents cheaper than PPL's default rate. So I'm saving money by switching to a renewable provider. That's not always the case. You do have to be careful about fees and contracts when you're checking out PA Power Switch. But sometimes renewables can actually be the cheaper option. Oftentimes, if it's not the cheapest option, it's a very small difference. So if cost is your only concern, it's usually pretty cost effective to go on to PA Power Switch and look up those different electricity rates. But for a lot of us, cost is not our only concern. If you can afford to pay a little bit more to procure green energy and it's worth it to you for those environmental benefits, some people have that option.
Yes, and it is interesting. I have had contact with people who've had the opportunity to install the solar and really reap the benefits from using that type of electricity. But it does take some time to go through the power choice and really analyze the contracts and the information. But in the long run, making the right choice can make a difference in the future. So how important is tree planting, and are there state programs to encourage municipalities to add to their tree canopy?
Yes, that's a great question. Um, so trees in our communities are so important, not just because they create oxygen and sequester carbon dioxide, but because they reduce temperatures in those communities. There have been study after study showing the stark difference in surface temperatures between areas of cities that have good tree canopy versus those that don't. Um, and we do in the state of Pennsylvania have programs to help communities plant trees. I think DCNR is a really great resource to find those opportunities.
Well, and that leads me to another question. How can individuals in the Commonwealth contribute or get involved? We talked about power choice. We talked a little bit about installing solar or other, but what else can people do?
Yeah, to reduce your personal greenhouse gas carbon footprint, energy efficiency is always the first step. You want to weatherize your homes. When you have to replace your refrigerator or your stove, choose an Energy Star model. Um, Insulate your attic. There's things that you can do that will reduce your energy costs as well as reduce your carbon footprint. Um, on on a larger scale, on a community scale, being involved in your local community is really important. Being part of the decisions that happen in your local community in terms of land use, whether or not vacant lots are turned into public parks, or um, green infrastructure is installed to handle stormwater versus culverts, or but being involved in your local community and making those decisions is really important.
So leads to another question. And it's kind of at this point, the damage is done. So is the goal to reduce future damage, repair past damage, both? What would be the ultimate goal?
Yeah, great question. That's exactly right. We are already experiencing the impacts of climate change. If we cut off all of our greenhouse gas emissions today, we would still experience some additional warming of the global climate. So we really need to focus on adapting to those changes, to reducing our vulnerability to those changes, but also mitigating greenhouse gas emissions so it doesn't get worse than it has to be. So both of those things are very important.
I want to thank everyone for your questions. If you still have a question, Lindsay's contact information was dropped into the chat, and you can be directly in touch with her. Lindsay, what would you like the audience to remember from today's program?
I would like the audience to remember that while this is a very serious issue, and I may be biased, but the most serious environmental issue of our time. It is not a hopeless issue. We have the technology, we have the ability to tackle this challenge. And we have the ability to adapt.
I appreciate your optimism. Thank you so much for being part of this program today.
Thank
To
you
our
so much.
audience, oh, you're welcome. To our audience, if you'd like to explore more about this topic, you can visit the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection website or the State Museum of Pennsylvania website. Please join us again for more Learn at Lunchtime programs. You can go to the museum's website for program information and to sign up.